Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and today I want to actually start talking about marine biology. We've talked about oceanography and marine chemistry and marine ecology, but now I really want to get down to the nitty-gritty of actual marine organisms. And we're going to start by dividing those marine organisms into two categories, benthic organisms and pelagic organisms. And I want to specifically talk to you today about the benthic ones, but we'll also talk about what pelagic actually means as well. And then we're going to talk about what the different zones of the benthic ocean are in order to talk specifically about rocky shores and really what organisms are that live on rocky shores and what do they do in order to be able to live on rocky shores. So that's today's lesson, and let's begin. So all of the ocean can be divided into two basic zones for the purposes of biology. The first zone is the pelagic zone. Quite simply, this is the open ocean. We're not going to talk about this in this unit. We're going to talk about the pelagic ocean, fish, sharks, rays, skates, cartilaginous fish, bony fish, whales. We're going to talk about all of them actually in the next unit. In this unit, we're going to stick specifically to the benthic ocean. Any water that's near the ocean bottom. This means the very, very deep ocean, but it also means the very, very shallow ocean as well. In other words, it means basically anywhere that you're near the ocean bottom and in the ocean. So it's right when you walk offshore, and then if you sink to the bottom of the ocean, of the bottom of the Marianas Trench. Pelagic ocean is the open ocean. Benthic ocean is anything near the ocean bottom. There are actually 5 distinct benthic regions that are separated because the organisms in those regions do different things and are adapted to do different things. But we're actually going to talk about 6 regions of the oceans in this chapter, 5 of which are true benthic regions, and then the 6th is a little strange, and I'll get to that in a second. So here we go. What are those 5 benthic regions that we're going to talk about? Well, the first is this, rocky shores. Shores are any area of the ocean bottom that's subject to tidal variation, where the water goes in and out every single day. And a rocky shore is a shore made out of rock, as the name would suggest. The second is sediment-covered shores. When you have a shore not made out of rock, it's usually going to be made out of sand, silt, clay, or mud, and that's a sediment-covered shore. The third is this, coral reefs. This we'll talk about in 3 lessons from now, but a coral reef is absolutely near the ocean bottom. Coral is a bottom-dwelling sessile organism, and coral reefs are a benthic region. Next is this, when I say the ocean bottom, probably what you think of, which is the deep ocean. Anywhere that's on the deep, deep, deep ocean floor. Then there's this, which a lot of people don't consider a benthic region, but it actually is, the continental shelf. The shallowest parts of the ocean closest to the continents. This is where you go deep-sea fishing. This is where you swim offshore. This is where boats sail around or you go jet skiing. It's also where most of the life is in the ocean. The last of these 6 zones, those 5, rocky shores, sediment-covered shores, coral reefs, deep oceans, and continental shelves, those are your 5 true benthic regions. The 6th one is a little bit different. We're also in this unit going to talk about ice, the Arctic and the Antarctic, the North Pole and the South Pole. Those aren't really benthic regions. We'll talk a little bit about pelagic organisms in those zones, but truth be told, we really don't have too many other places to talk about ice. And so me and Dan, Mr. Kruger, got together and we were talking about where we can stick it and where we can actually talk about ice. And we both agreed that this would be the best chapter really to fit it in. And we both wanted to talk about it because it's an entirely different ecosystem. It's kind of interesting. So we're going to talk about ice. Ice we're going to count as a benthic region even though it's not truly considered to be a benthic region. So rocky shores, sediment-covered shores, coral reefs, deep oceans, and continental shelves are our 5 or 6 benthic regions that we're going to talk about. And today we're going to start talking about rocky shores. Again, areas that are subject to tidal energy that are made out of rock. So, there's your definition. Benthic environments that are covered with rock that become partially and completely exposed by the tides. The most notable feature on a rocky shore is vertical zonation. What does that mean? Well, that means that rock dries out a lot faster than sediment. And so, if you look at a rocky shore, what you'll notice is there's a distinct banding pattern that forms. There's 3, actually, distinct banding patterns. One here, one here, one here. Those bands are formed by organisms that are better or worse at resisting drying out. Those bands are formed by organisms that are better or worse at staying wet and keeping moist when the tide goes out. Because that highest band is going to be dry for most of the day, and that lowest band is going to be wet for most of the day. And as a result, you need to be better or worse able at resisting drying out, keeping wet when that tide goes out. Verticozonation creates three distinct zones: the upper intertidal zone, the middle intertidal zone, and the lower intertidal zone. The upper intertidal zone is the highest on a rocky shore. It's the area that's only wet during high tide, and therefore during middle and low tide, the upper intertidal zone is basically completely dry. As a result, organisms that live in the upper intertidal zone, they need to actually be better able to stay moist when the tide goes out. The middle intertidal zone is a little bit different. It's moist during, or wet or covered with water during middle and low tide. And as a result, it's basically covered and uncovered with water for equal parts of the day. Organisms that live in the middle intertidal zone need to be okay at resisting drying out, but not quite as good as organisms in the upper intertidal zone. And then you get the lower intertidal zone. The lower intertidal zone is basically covered with water during all parts of the day. It's only exposed during the lowest part of low tide or the extreme low spring tide. And as a result, the organisms that live in the lower intertidal zone generally aren't very good at resisting drying out when compared to those in the middle intertidal zone or those in the upper intertidal zone. Upper, middle, and lower intertidal zones is the vertical zonation seen on any rocky shores. And it divides the rocky shores into three areas where organisms in those three areas need to be either better or worse at resisting drying out. The first zone I want to talk about is the upper intertidal zone. The upper intertidal zone, like I said, is an area that's covered with water only during high tide. As a result, it spends most of the day completely dry. Organisms in this area need to be very, very well adapted at resisting drying out. The most common way that organisms do resist drying out in this area is an adaptation that I'm going to call running and hiding. Organisms in this area usually are mobile. If you look at this crack, right, you'll see a bunch of little snails and limpets hiding in the cracks of these rocks. And that's because when the tide goes out, the wettest and coolest part of this rock is going to be this crack. In order to resist drying out when the tide goes out, these organisms, these snails who lived in the upper intertidal zone, ran and hid into the cool, moist cracks and crevices of the rock. And that's what they're going to do until the tide comes in. They're just going to chill out in these cracks and crevices until the tide comes back in. Organisms in the upper tide zone need to be well adapted at resisting drying out, resisting desiccation. And that adaptation that they most commonly display is the ability to run and hide into moist places or cool places in order to wait for the tide to come back in. The next zone that we're going to talk about is the middle intertidal zone. The middle intertidal zone is covered and uncovered with water for about equal parts of the day. So a little bit more covered with water or covered with water for longer than the upper intertidal zone. Organisms that live here usually have shells. They're mussels and barnacles. And as a result, these organisms don't run and hide, but instead, these organisms can do something called what I'm going to call clamming up. They can shut their shell and seal water inside their shell in order to keep from drying out when that tide goes back out. Now, this is a relatively small amount of water, and you can see these mussels are dark in color. So that small amount of water is going to heat up a lot as the tide goes out. And if they lived in the upper intertidal zone, that water would heat up so much that it basically cook the mussel from the inside out and kill it. But luckily, they don't live in the upper intertidal zone. They live in the middle intertidal zone. So that water is going to come in faster than these mussels will necessarily heat up and dry out as a result of clamming up. I should mention, by the way, that I call it clamming up just because if I call it muscling up, it sounds like something else. So clamming up is a clam is actually a sediment-covered shore organism. It's not usually a rocky shore organism. The reason is because clams burrow, and nothing can burrow into rock except for one species of mussel called the rock burrowing mussel, but that's besides the point. So I call it clamming up, and that's kind of a bad name just because clams don't live on a rocky shore. But when I talk about clamming up, what I mean to kind of trigger in your mind is the idea of an organism with a shell and the ability to shut that shell to seal in water in order to stay wet when the tide goes out. The last zone of the rocky shore that I want to talk about is the low tide zone. Organisms in the low tide zone aren't very well adapted at resisting drying out. And the reason is quite simple. They're not dry for most of the day. Most of the day they're completely covered with water. Organisms that live here are usually seaweeds and sea mosses and that sort of thing. And these organisms usually sit and bear it. What that means is that organisms in the low tide zone stay wet by just sitting there and waiting for the tide to come back in. This doesn't sound very impressive. I mean, it sounds like they're just kind of waiting around, and they are, but they can afford to just kind of sit around and wait for the tide to come back in because the reality is it's going to come back in pretty soon. They're only going to be above water for 1, 2, 3 hours a day at most. And as a result, they don't need to be very well adapted at resisting drying out. These organisms can actually usually slow down their metabolic rate in the process. So really, they die slower as a result of drying out. And that's how they last and kind of outlast the tide coming back in. I should mention that really in the low tide zone, all you really see is Irish mosses and seaweeds and things of this nature. And that's because these are the only organisms that can stand to lose 90% of their body moisture and regain it twice a day. Something that more advanced organisms would have a lot more trouble doing. So that's it for our introduction to benthic organisms. Again, what we started doing was talking about the difference between benthic and pelagic, the idea that benthic is anything near the ocean bottom and pelagic is anything that swims through the ocean. And then we started talking about the different benthic zones. We talked about the two types of shores, rocky and sediment-covered shores. And then we talked about coral reefs. We talked about continental shelves, the deep ocean, and that sixth one that we're going to talk about, which is ice. We talked about the three zones of the rocky shore, the vertical zonation of the rocky shore, the upper, middle, and low tide zone. And we talked about that zonation forms because rock dries out a lot faster than sediment. And as a result, organisms in those zones have to be better or worse at resisting drying out depending on what zone they live in. Organisms in the upper intertidal zone need to be really well adapted to resist drying out. So these organisms usually run and hide, or they could run and hide, clam up, and sit and bear it, or do any combination. They might have more than one adaptation to resist drying out. And then there's organisms that live in the middle tide zone. These organisms are usually mussels and barnacles, things with shells that can seal water inside their shells to resist drying out. Lastly, we have organisms that live in the lower intertidal zone, which aren't very well adapted to resist drying out because they're not going to be above water for most of the time. And as a result, these organisms in the lower intertidal zone basically just sit and bear it, sit and wait for the tide to come back in order to keep from drying out. So that's it for today on benthic organisms and specifically the rocky shore. Next lesson is going to be on sediment-covered shores and the different adaptations you see there. Thanks for listening and have a nice day.